By now, our demo app is pretty much finished, and we learned a lot about Django and its core features. There are only a few minor tweaks and polishing steps I want to take before we wrap up this course here. So what else could we fine-tune or optimize? Well, we got a problem. If I do open such a meetup and I try to sign up with an email address which I already used, I get an error that a participant with this email already exists. Now, what happens if I go to another meetup though, to the second meetup? Do I get the same issue here? I do. And that's a problem. Now, it might make sense to show this kind of error if we try to sign up for a meetup with an email address we already did use for signing up to that meetup. Even though we could argue that in that case, it would also be no problem if we just accept this registration again and we just don't do anything about it behind the scenes. We just ignore it since the user already did sign up. But it makes absolutely no sense, and it is an error if we show this error message if we try to sign up to another meetup with an email address we used for yet another meetup. Because of course we should be able to use the same email address to sign up for multiple meetups. And currently that fails. We can only use each email address once. Now, why is this happening? This happens because in views.py, we do create a new participant with this line of code here by calling the save method. I do create a new participant here, and the problem is, of course, that every participant can only be created once because in our model, we also set the email field to be unique. So if we try to sign up with the same email for different meetups, I try to create multiple participants with the same email, and that fails. And of course, I don't want to have the same email address multiple times in my database. So that generally is what I want. But what I'd like to change is that I don't always call save here, but I either save or I just get an existing participant. So I just look into the database, and if I already have a participant for this email address, I take that participant instead of creating a new one. And of course, thankfully, that is also not an uncommon case and therefore something which is fairly easy to implement. Instead of calling save here, which of course is very convenient, but instead of calling that, we can also access the cleaned data field on our registration form. Cleaned data holds a dictionary and it holds all the data entered by the user as a key value pairs in that dictionary. So here I can access the email field, the email key. Why email? Because this form is based on the participant model, and from that model, from this model here, we use the email field, and hence the field in the form will have that same name. So we can access this field, this data which was entered by the user in that form under that key, and that will give us access to the entered user email. So here we now get the user email. Now with that information, we can now create a participant ourselves. And I'm doing that because if I use the participant model for creating that participant instead of this form, then I have control over how it's created and I can check whether I do have a participant before I try to create a new one. So therefore, in this views.py file, from the models file, we can import participant, this model. And then in the view function here, we can use this participant model to create a new participant if we don't have one for this email address yet. We do this with participant objects and then get or create. That's a convenience method which Django offers to us, which allows us to create a new instance of that model and store it in the database if we don't have an existing record yet, or use an existing one instead. And to get or create, we now just need to pass a keyword argument that allows Django to look into the database table and find a possibly existing entry. And here I want to tell Django that it should look for the email field in this participant database table. And if we have an entry for this user email already, then I want to use that existing participant object from the database. If we don't find a participant with that email here, then I want to create a new one. That's what get or create does. Now, get or create returns a tuple where we get the created or identified object, and where we get a flag was created that tells us whether a new entry was created or not. Now, I'm actually not interested in was created here, so I'll use an underscore to signal that I'll ignore that value, but I am interested in the participant, which we either created or retrieved because it already existed. Because I want to add this participant as a related participant to my selected meetup. That does not change. So that code line stays the same and the rest of the code stays the same. But now we have a more flexible creation method here. Now, one thing I do want to change though is my form in the forms.py file. Here we are currently using a model form, but actually using a model form is now kind of redundant here because we don't use the save method anymore and we are inferring our form from a very simple model anyways. And therefore I want to introduce another way of building such a form object. Model form can be convenient if you want to infer a form from a model and then use the save method, but you can also build a form object which gives you all that validation logic and so on by just inheriting from the form class instead of model form. With that, you have to define all the form fields on your own, but of course here, in this case, that's very easy to do because we don't have a complex form which we want to build here. Here, I just want to make sure that we have an email field. So now we add fields to our form by adding them as simple class variables. And we now tell Django, by using this forms object, which kind of form field that will be. And that should be an email field, which of course should not be confused with the email field I have in my model here. This email field is coming from the models object. In forms.py, it's coming from the forms object. Here it's just used to tell Django which kind of input field, which HTML input field should be created and how the input should be validated. This will not have an effect on any database because this is now really just there to collect user data through a form. It has no relation to any database or anything like that. And therefore now here I'll remove that model import of the participant model and just create my form field like this. And here we can also add a label keyword argument to tell Django what the form label for that email field should be. And here I'll just say your email. That should be my label, like this. And if I now save this and I reload this page for a single meetup, you see I got the same form as before, but now with that your email label. And now if I try to sign up with an email address that I used before, this succeeds here. This succeeds because now we have this updated form, which is decoupled from the participant model. And we have the updated views code where we check for the existence of this object before we possibly create a new entry in the database. And that's some extra fine-tuning which I wanted to add here to make sure that we have the correct and intended behavior for this sign-up process, which we of course also want to have as part of this application.